Welcome to part 5 of the Highlands Wrap Dress Sewalong. Today we'll be sewing our side seams, sewing the hem, and sewing on our buttons. We're almost done! Okay, the first thing we need to do before we sew up our side seams is finish the edges so they don't fray. Here I'm using a serger to finish all 4 raw edges of the side seams before we sew them up. Be sure to go slow at the waistband. That seam is pretty thick, and you'll want to make sure that you're finishing all of the layers of fabric there. You might notice that I'm serging the raw edges in the opposite direction as shown in the instructions. That's fine, as long as you carefully serge off the side seam before getting to the step. Okay, next we'll prepare our hem for sewing. To do this, press the hem towards the wrong side on the front and back bodices by 3/8 inch. You'll do this along the perpendicular edges, but not along the diagonal edge. And then we'll align our side seams right sides together, making sure to match those notches on the front bodice with the waistband and pin well. I also like to place a pin at the bottom marking that reminds me to stop sewing there. Now, sew the side seams with a 3/8 inch seam allowance down to the marking and backstitch at the marking a few times. Repeat this for the opposite side seam. Press the side seams open. You might not be able to press the side seam open at the waistband due to the bulk there, and that's okay. You can leave it pressed to one side at that point. And then fold the step corners under at a 45-degree angle. Now this doesn't have to be exact, just try to make both corners fold at roughly the same angle and pin. Okay, now we're ready to create our mitered corners. Fold the diagonal edge of the hem in half with right sides together so that the folded edges meet. Now make sure to keep those edges folded and sew this seam with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Clip the corner and press the seam open as best you can. Now turn the hem right side out and use a point turner to get a nice crisp point at the corner. You have a mitered corner. Nifty, right? Okay, let's sew this hem. Press the entire hem towards the wrong side by 1 1/2 inch. Pin at the corners and around the hem as needed. And then sew the hem down with a 1 3/8 inch seam allowance. Again, I'm sewing on the wrong side of the dress here to make sure I catch the hem with my stitch all of the way around. At the slit, pivot at the 45-degree angle and sew all the way up to the stitch line. And then pivot again and sew down the other side of the 45-degree angle. The last step for today is to sew on the buttons and open up our buttonholes. I like to sew on my buttons with my sewing machine, but you can sew them on by hand. I simply lower the feed dogs and use a zigzag stitch that is the same width as the holes of the button. Now just place the button on the marking on the bodice and simply sew 10 or so stitches through the holes, leaving long thread tails. And then pull the threads to the back of the button with a hand sewing needle and tie them into a knot and trim. Finally, let's open up the buttonholes on our button tabs. I apply a little bit of fray check to the buttonhole, and then I carefully use my thread snips to open up the buttonhole by cutting it. You can use your seam ripper or any other special tool for this, but be really careful that you don't cut through any of the stitches. Okay, that's it for part 5 of the Highlands Wrap Dress Sew-Along. In part 6, we'll finish up the sew-along by sewing the sleeves or the arm's eye facings of the dress, depending on which view you're sewing.